This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Berda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. Our guest today is a Tel Aviv-based journalist and author. He's the Middle East correspondent for the Dutch Financial Daily. His first book, Nazi Billionaires, The Dark Histories of Germany's Wealthiest Dynasties, has just been published in English by HarperCollins. David de Jong, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi Gilad, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So Germany is often praised for having dealt openly and sincerely with its Nazi past, yet, as you show in your book, the wealthiest families in post-war Germany have refused to own up to that or eluded any allegations as to their deep ties with the Nazi government. So this could suggest one of two things: that this assumption about Germany's efforts to atone is a myth, or that the most powerful players in its economy have been exempt. Which is it?
It's a combination of both, but it's particularly point number two, is that, and you see that in many societies around the world, is where the wealthiest and the most powerful actors in society, whether financially, economically, politically, pay, lip service to a remembrance culture, in this case in Germany, where, where the families behind, in this case BMW and Porsche and other big, global German brands say, we remember, the atrocities that our families or that our companies partook in, but at the same time, what they actually do, in effect, is that they, maintain media prizes and global foundations and museums and academic chairs and corporate headquarters in the name of their fathers, grandfathers, their company saviors, who, were incredibly successful in business, but also committed the most horrific war crimes during the Third Reich, particularly during World War II.
And that applies not just to the descendants, but also to the people themselves, the very founders of the dynasties that you talk about and write about in the book. And that is in a way also fits into the broader understanding of the remembrance culture in Germany, because if you think about it, I mean, the Frankfurt trials of the 1960s were exactly about the same thing, right? How the big industrialists and even some government functionaries were in fact Nazi operatives. And also this was one of the talking points of the revolutionary left in West Germany, and predominantly Baader-Meinhof.
Yeah.
In what way is what you're unveiling here in the book new?
I mean, it is exactly the predominant narrative around the world, right, is that Germany has done such a great job with the remembrance culture. And I think it's fair to say that for a big part of society, they have. But, people consume, whether it is, car companies like BMW or Volkswagen or, Porsche, if you're lucky enough, well, if you're wealthy enough, I wouldn't say lucky, or, Audi, or you name it, or, you have insurance with Allianz or Munich Re, or you have, you bake your cakes with Dr. Oetker pudding mix. It's that there is this kind of disconnect between, yes, at one hand, Germany's remembrance culture, at the other hand, Germany's, and not only Germany, but also Europe and world, some of the most, wealthiest families behind these brands, who control these brands, consumer-facing brands daily, where they whitewash history very brazenly, but very also in a kind of subtle, insidious way, of their fathers and grandfathers who made these brands, who either created these brands or made them big, and that is certainly something that, even in Germany, many consumers, many people don't know.
And I find that so fascinating. I mean, given the amount of organizations and funds and research that actually goes into finding perpetrators, and suddenly you're talking to us about this island of impunity or exemption, and it's just really fascinating, especially at this time. But I want to ask you make this early on in the book, you make this comparison with what's going on in the UK and the US, with the toppling of the statues of colonialists and slave owners and drivers, and you make the case that they're in this decolonization process that is going on, partial, of course, that is going on in the US and the UK. Something is not happening on the same level in Germany. How do you explain that?
I mean, the processes in the US and the UK are, much more belatedly, right? This is in many ways, this is more than 150 years ago when slavery was abolished in the US, but they're only starting to reckoning with it now, right? In a sense, Germany is quicker on the uptake, but it leaves out for most of the, again, there's this kind of vacuum when it pertains to some of the most well-known names in Germany and globally, whether it's men like Ferdinand or Ferry Porsche, who of course have their name attached to a brand, right? But a lot of people knew that Ferdinand Porsche designed the Volkswagen, that Hitler tasked him to design the Volkswagen. But very few people know that Ferry Porsche, who made Porsche the global sports car brand that it is today, was a voluntary SS officer who surrounded himself with former SS officers in the Porsche, directors' chambers in the 1950s and 60s. But most importantly, also that a co-founder of Porsche was a Jewish man called Adolf Rosenberger, who was pushed out of the company in 1935 and was subsequently erased from Porsche history. And there is, again, it's this disconnect between, on a macro level, the remembrance culture and the discussions on a micro level when it comes to individuals. And that kind of silence still pervades, in my view, the whole of German culture, not only at the top, not only with the very most powerful, because everyone in Germany is happy to partake as a whole of society in remembrance culture. But talk to your friends about what their grandparents did during the Third Reich, during World War II, and it's still an extremely painful subject because nobody really wants to talk about it still on a micro level, on an individual level, and that for sure is the case with Germany's wealthiest and most powerful families.
What do you think would have been a better or a more powerful repentance for these people? I mean, the founders themselves, the actual perpetrators, and even more so today, their children, grandchildren who've enjoyed this status, but I mean, there weren't those who committed the crimes.
Right, indeed. So, I mean, in the book, I focus on 5 business dynasties, which are still some of the world's, either most wealthiest or kind of economically most powerful families. Not only on a German, on a European level, but really global, and they still need to be operationally active in business as a whole, or either, manage their billions globally. And, these families profited through, mass arms production, the mass exploitation of forced and slave labor during the war, as well as the mass expropriation, not only of Jewish-owned businesses, but also businesses in German-occupied territories across Europe. Now, what happened after the war is that, bar 3 industrialist trials during Nuremberg, all of German industry and all of German business who had, profited greatly of the Third Reich went scot-free in these so-called denazification trials. And that's not only for the top. I mean, it was across German society, and not only in the business world, but also in the medical world, in the legal world, in, education, academia, you name it, that the so-called process of denazification never took place. Denazification is a myth in Germany. There was a continuation of money and power from the Third Reich to West Germany. And that's because the Cold War started. And in early 1947, the US, which was leading in occupied West Germany at the time, made this policy decision. The Truman administration made this policy decision. Hey, we need a economically strong West Germany with a viable democracy, as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and occupied Eastern Germany and the encroachment of communism. And as a result, they started handing over hundreds of thousands of suspected Nazi war criminals and ardent Nazi sympathizers back to West German authorities, who had no incentive whatsoever of, judging their fellow compatriots on crimes that they had committed themselves, or, sympathies that they had shared or that they'd held themselves as well. So, for bar one of my main characters who actually ended up for Nuremberg, all of the men that I write about in the book
and was jailed and then set free and then resumed his position,
and then was back as Germany's wealthiest man within a decade, as controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz.
So wait a minute. So what you're basically saying is that there's these two logics. One logic was reserved for a political, legal, administrative elite that were persecuted.
Yeah.
And the other was the economic logic that was then whitewashed and allowed to continue. And so it's about the kind of sphere, kind of separating the politics from economics, even though there's no question that they were entirely involved in the political project of the Third Reich.
Yeah, I mean, I think they went hand in hand. They went hand in hand, I would argue, because, if you look at the entire profiteering system from the business side in the Third Reich, that went hand in hand with the political, because Hitler seizes power January 30th, 1933. And then what he initially promises these men, who were not themselves, would say, half of my characters are opportunists in the book and the other half are ideologues. But it was the opportunists who for sure profited the most and who were successful in any, political system. But what Hitler promises them, and of course this comes at the tail end of the Great Depression, and is that they're going to, that he's going to initiate rearmament, which was technically forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles. And, before they know it, in early 1934, they have billions of Reichsmark flowing into their coffers, into their factories, and the only thing they were interested in was protecting their fortunes, protecting their business empires, and expanding both. And that's what they buy into, and Hitler delivers on that promise initially, and then you see, and of course, mass producing weapons in itself is not a criminal act, although it technically was under the Treaty of Versailles for Germany. But you see this kind of grayscale. You see the grayscale. You see it developing into criminal behavior when, after the initiation of the Nuremberg race laws, of the implementation of the Nuremberg race laws in September 1935, where the expropriation of Jewish businesses and Jewish families is ramped up, and which initially has the veneer of a legal transaction, even though they're coerced to sell their businesses or their shares or their real estate far under the fair market value of these assets or of these companies, or they want to sell it for a fire sale price because they want to leave. They want to leave Germany as soon as possible, and that devolves into outright theft or outright robbery as persecution is ramped up over the course of the latter half of the 1930s. That continues, that criminal behavior in German occupied territories during World War II. And of course, its low point is in the mass exploitation of forced and slave labor, of the tens of millions that are deported to Nazi Germany to are exploited in German factories and mines. So it was very much the business and the political very much went hand in hand, and it was it enabled them to profit, and that's continued after the war.
But more than that, I think that one of the more powerful points that you make in the book is that it wasn't. I mean, their complicity with the Nazi regime was not just out of some profiteering opportunism, but also the fact that they were actually instrumental in helping the Nazis getting to power. I mean, it's not just, okay, the Nazis are here, let's try and make as much money as we can, and there was a lot of money to be made. But also they knew in advance, whether it was out of some ideology or just also a business sense, but they knew in advance that the Nazis would be good for them, and therefore they pull their weight in not an insignificant way to make sure that it happens.
Yeah, but that only happens after Hitler seizes power. I would say in the run-up, and Hitler didn't really have any meaningful ties to German business. Once Nazi Party initially becomes successful, which is in September 1930, where it suddenly becomes the second largest party in parliament, and riding the wave of discontent following the start of the Great Depression. He tries to initiate. Well, he summons businessmen who are curious to know this new guy, but they kind of think him and the Nazi Party are these kind of boorish, kind of clownish figures, impoverished figures from the German hinterlands, and that only changes. These men are conservative establishment figures, and Hitler and the Nazis are really fringe. That only changes after he seizes power, and they explicitly kind of fall in line again with this promise of rearmament, and they help fund, his re-election campaign because the Nazi Party is broke. In March 1933, I mean that whole re-election campaign ends up being a sham, but they have no qualms of signing over German democracy following his seizure of power in January 1933, and the kind of the meetings they have subsequently, and where they decide to fund, this kind of election campaign / fund.
Yeah, the book opens in this setting, this preface where they're actually funding the re-election campaign, and you bring this excerpt from Goebbels' diary, where the day before he the propaganda office is broke, and the day after the machines are working, and he's happy about the possibility to kind of run the campaign. And so that opening of the book is a very important start there, because I think what was most striking to me is that I don't remember who it is, but someone promises this is a period of unrest, right?
Yeah.
One government coming down and another coming in, and they're promising them political stability and possibly no re-election for the next 10 years. Or no re-election for the next 100 years. And there's this. It's a very powerful opening for that, because you do realize, and it's funny thinking about it, today in various places with political instability, and the way that there's this desire to have some sort of kind of strong form, and you wonder at this and this separation between the politics and the economics.
No, but also the fact that it's not just the desire of the left out, but it's also the desire of the most powerful people in the economy.
Yeah. No, you're completely right. Yeah, I mean, what both Hitler and Göring in this meeting of February 21st, 1933, promise the 24 assembled businessmen in the prologue of my book, which took place at the palace of Hermann Göring, at the time the parliamentary president. This is 3 weeks after Hitler seizes power. These men are invited to the palace under the disguise that Hitler is going to explain his economic policies. But what it actually is a very frank, frank in a way that what they explicitly, promise is that this is going to be the election of March 5th, 1933. Is going to be the last election in 100 years, and these men have no qualms of signing over, but they need money, and these men have no qualms signing over German democracy, paying in to this election campaign / fund, and effectively, democracies ended, or German democracies ended, a month later. After the Reichstag fire and martial law is declared, so the money they pay in the end, or that whole re-election, is no longer really relevant. But when they're asked to step up, or at least when they're asked to sign over German democracy, they do so without any hesitation.
How difficult was it to tap into, in terms of your research? You're saying that a lot of it is a taboo in Germany, but I'm wondering how actively taboo it is. I mean, was there any information that was deliberately concealed, or is it just that people would prefer to turn a blind eye?
I mean, so I don't know if it was deliberately concealed. I mean, a lot of these family archives are quite hidden away, or are not as easily accessible, but they are accessible. The few of the families, like the Quandt family, which one branch owns the BMW Group, or is the majority shareholder of the BMW Group today, which makes them Germany's wealthiest family and Europe's wealthiest family. The other branch descends from Magda Goebbels, but that's a story for another time. Or the Flick family archive, in the former controlling shareholders of Daimler-Benz. It's in Berlin. It's pretty hidden away. It's like in the most furthest northwest corner of Berlin. And, you have to, it's like at the back of a building. You have to walk up 4 floors.
But it is open to the public.
It's open for the public. You have to make an appointment.
Right.
Same with the Quandt family archive. It's in Darmstadt, which is south of Frankfurt. But, I started reporting on this subject when I was a reporter for Bloomberg News in New York. And I would, they'd asked me to cover this subject. I was part of a new investigative team at the time in late 2011, which covered family-owned companies. And they asked me to if I could cover, I was hired as a North America reporter, but they asked me to cover if I could cover the German-speaking companies, because I'm born in the Netherlands and I'm Dutch. So, and I would go.
You're all the same for Americans.
Exactly. Yeah. That was a little bit. Hey, we have this Dutch guy. We have this Dutch guy. We have this Dutch guy here. That's just Deutsch, Dutch. Exactly. Yeah, that was. Yeah. I think there was a little bit of thinking. I never really had, but I didn't want to confirm. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, when I went to Germany, and I would go between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I would go there and report from Bloomberg bureaus on these stories, and all these stories I would come back with were this mix of the financial and the historical, and this kind of, and what struck me was this whitewashing that was still going on by the families behind, particularly BMW and Porsche, and what they do to pacify the subject is that they, whenever a scandal arises in German media about, the Nazi past of a beloved company or a beloved patriarch, so they commission these academic studies, which are, 1,200 pages, long in academic German. And it's a very smart way of pacifying the subject, because, these books are only ever discussed once they come out, many years after the fact. In academic German, so it never reaches a broad audience in Germany. But if somebody asks, then the family can say, "Oh yeah, we have it all figured out." It's all there. We've researched it, but the details are basically hidden in plain sight, and that's and allows them then to, on their websites of their global charitable foundations, for BMW and Porsche and other consumer brands, to not to not list any of the details there. Not say that Ferry Porsche was a voluntary SS officer, or not say that BMW Savior also built concentration camps and exploited thousands of female concentration camp captives, or acquired acquired companies stolen from Jews in France, which in turn leads to, for example, BMW having a foundation today, the BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt, with the tagline "Inspire responsible leadership in the name of a Nazi war criminal." So that is the kind of the level. Yeah, I hate to use the word, but it's also just gaslighting. It's just lying to people's faces and actually being so blatant about whitewashing history.
Those studies by the historians that the family is higher,
and those are good.
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
Yeah.
I mean, do they stand up to scrutiny?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a few exceptions to the rule. There's Porsche, for instance, commissioned this terribly whitewashing study of Porsche during the Third Reich. There's a few other examples in German, but for the most part, those are really the exceptions. Those studies, those academic studies, stand up to scrutiny. The problem is that these families and these companies, after publication, choose not to show the facts anywhere and leave it in these studies, which also begs the question, who are you reckoning with, or who are you, who is this reckoning actually with that you're purporting to have? It's not with the German public. The vast majority of your victims weren't German. The surviving heirs of forced and slave laborers don't have access to these studies, or the families that were robbed of their companies or their belongings, and they don't have access to the big picture, to what happened to them. So it doesn't reach its intended audience. So that's what I aim to do with the book, was to bring these stories to a global audience.
So the book is really extremely well written, and you kind of read it breathlessly, and it's in great detail, right? But one of the things I was very curious about, why are you so interested in the emotional lives and the relationships in these families? Because in a way, and this is, coming from kind of my lawyerly background,
sure.
I'm kind of give us the evidence and the paper trail, great about Magda Goebbels, but, and her relationship to this tycoon guy. But, let's follow the trail. And in a way, and it's always there, and there, you really try and understand who these people are and what makes them tick. And I asked myself more than once, why?
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic, or
a lawyer,
for that matter. Exactly. So for me, it was really important also to bring these characters, while completely rooted in reality, bring them to life. In order to, also to you can't take the reader's attention for granted ever, and especially not in a narrative nonfiction. And it is important for the reader to also to take them there, as it were. And for that, I needed to bring the characters to life, and that's what was the main aspect of why I honed in on their personal lives as well, because you need to, even though they're all antagonists, you need to be taken into their lives, how they were leading it to the extent possible.
The book came out in German shortly after it came out in English. How was it received? Especially, I'd like you to focus on the fact that it was written by a non-German, by an interloper.
Yeah.
Was that an issue at all?
No, it wasn't. I think this book would have been very difficult for a German to write, because German society at its core is still deeply conservative, and it's also still deeply hierarchical. And for a German journalist to assail its own country's most powerful families, they can easily flip that question around and being like, okay, who are you to judge us? What did your father or grandfather do during the Third Reich. And I didn't have that problem.
Quite the contrary. You write in the book that your paternal grandparents were Holocaust survivors, right? It's your father's side.
I mean, on my maternal side, my maternal grandfather was actually captured by the Germans and was sentenced as a political prisoner and spent 2 years doing hard labor in the Ruhr area in a steel factory, and he barely survived. But my Jewish grandparents from my father's side, they hid. My grandfather hid for 3.5 years in Amsterdam and survived. And my grandmother, together with my aunt, was still alive today. She was 3 at the time, and they fled to Switzerland via France, and miraculously escaped, and were able. My grandmother was Swiss, so they were able to, in 1942, which at the time was pretty daring escape from the Netherlands, managed to get over the border and sit out the war in Switzerland and reunite with my grandfather after the war. Yeah, in Amsterdam.
But going back to how it was received in Germany.
Yeah.
So, what were the reactions like? Were people surprised? Were they dismissive? I mean, how did your book play into that remembrance culture that you were talking about?
I think a lot of people were surprised. They didn't know a lot of that was in the book, and I think well, as a result, it's been selling very well in Germany so far, and the reviews have also been good, because again, these facts are unknown even with a let alone abroad, but even with a German with the average German reader. They don't know about.
And these families, the companies. I mean, I have to say for our listeners, they didn't walk in with a bodyguard.
Right. Yeah. Well, you don't know. Maybe you don't see it.
Maybe it's waiting outside. Yeah.
I mean, these families, they didn't respond publicly. I also never got a lawyer letter from any of them, because what they want to do is their whole PR strategy is to ignore it, because for them the most damning thing to do is to start sending lawyer letters to a foreign journalist, and then the book that only draws attention to the subject. But some there's been some developments. I mean, BMW. The Porsche family settled with in October with the heirs of the Jewish co-founder of Porsche, Adolf Rosenberger, to give him his name back to rewrite his story back in Porsche history. That's something that's going to be happening over the next couple of years. And they had a massive IPO. They listed Porsche for 70 billion euros on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. So they needed to really clean house before that happened, and of course the publication of my book really added to that pressure. And same for the BMW Foundation. Herbert Quandt came under immense pressure from the fellows who had received money and who felt lied to by receiving money in the name of a Nazi war criminal. Actually, it was a British-Israeli guy called Anton Goodman who initiated this whole campaign after reading an interview with me in The Guardian about pushing the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt, to go public to be transparent about that Herbert Quandt, he was BMW's savior, but also a Nazi war criminal, and that's still he's made enormous strides in 6 months' time, or not, 6 to 8 months' time, but he's they still have ways to go, because that board is also stuck between the son of Herbert Quandt, Germany's wealthiest man, who's deeply conservative and wants to protect his father's legacy and doesn't want to go truly transparent about his father's dark past, and a global coterie of fellows who have received money and want change and want transparency. So it's an interesting battle that's still being played out.
I have one more question. What is reckoning with the economic side of atrocities entail? Yeah,
that's a very good question. I mean, I can break it down.
You don't necessarily have an answer to, but I think that there's no question that this book will have a lot of interest in it, in Israel and the region. Yeah. But also there is this larger question.
Sure. It's an exercise in philosophy, in the philosophy of morals, right?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so they got off the hook, they made all this money. Yeah. What now?
Yeah. I mean, practically to give you the legal answer. I mean, what happened after the war is there were restitution proceedings were initiated for those heirs, for those families that had survived, or and most of those cases are finished. There's still a lot of cases, restitution cases going on with regards to art and real estate. And then there was the wholesale compensation question, which was, quote unquote, solved in 1999 when the U.S. and Germany made this treaty that compensated surviving forced and slave laborers, and they paid out German business, and the German state paid out about $10 billion between 2001 and 2006. But there was a clause in that treaty which said that German companies and as a whole didn't have to admit any kind of guilt or culpability. And that's really what allowed, in my view, these companies to continue lying about the past. And that's the point of my book, is that to show that German business, or the most powerful actors in German business today, have never taken any kind of moral responsibility for the atrocities of the Third Reich. And that is still the case. They have never. There's a difference between paying money and taking responsibility for the crimes that as a company that as a companies have committed, or that, even though you're not, of course, the heirs are not guilty for the crimes that their fathers committed, but coming clean with that past, taking responsibility for that past, and not trying to hide it away, which is still what's being done today. And I wanted to shine a light on that.
All right, David de Jong, journalist and author, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us about your new book, Nazi Billionaires: The Dark Histories of Germany's Wealthiest Dynasties. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And many thanks to you, Yael, and to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please write us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.